The dust of Silver Mesa was a living thing. It was born of the red earth, lifted by a wind that never seemed to rest, and it settled into the lines of every face, the folds of every garment, the soul of every inhabitant. In the year of our Lord 1878, the dust was the first and last thing you tasted, a fine grit of truth that coated every prayer and every promise. Evelyn Brooks knew the dust intimately. At 21 years of age, the daughter of the town's only minister, she battled it daily in the small garden behind the parsonage. She fought to coax green life, pale zinnias and stubborn squash vines, from a soil that preferred to surrender only shades of brown and ochre. Her world was measured by the length of her father's sermons and the precise rows of her vegetables. It was a quiet, orderly world, walled in by scripture and the sheer, skeletal ridges of the mountains that clawed at the vast, indifferent sky. She had been taught that God was in the order, in the clean lines of the chapel and the unwavering text of the good book. Savagery, she learned, was in the wilderness that began where the town's last building cast its shadow. On this particular afternoon, the sun was a hammer, beating the heat into the very planks of the boardwalk. Even the flies moved with a certain languor. Evelyn was on her knees, her calico dress smudged with red earth, gently clearing dust from the broad leaves of a squash plant. Her bonnet had slipped back, and the sun warmed her neatly pinned brown hair. There was a rhythm to her work, a peace she found in this small, defiant patch of green. The rhythm was broken by a sudden stillness. It was not silence, for the desert was never truly silent, but a change in the town's familiar hum. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The low murmur of women talking over a fence post went quiet. It was a held breath, a collective tensing of shoulders. Evelyn felt it in her own body, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the heat. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walked to the corner of the parsonage, peering down the town's single, wide street. He came from the west, a lone rider materializing out of the shimmering heat haze. He did not ride like a cowboy, loose and easy in the saddle. He sat straight, a part of the powerful buckskin horse beneath him, moving with a fluid economy that seemed both weary and deliberate. The town saw an Indian. They saw the long, dark hair, the high cheekbones, the buckskin pants and the worn, army-issue jacket that seemed a contradiction on his frame. Whispers, dry as cicada wings, began to pass from one shaded doorway to the next. Shutters were latched not with a bang, but with a soft, final click. Mothers appeared as if from the earth itself to pull their children indoors. Silver Mesa was shrinking, pulling into itself like a snail into its shell. Evelyn remained where she was, partially hidden by the corner of the white-clapboard church. She had been raised on fear. Stories of raids, of wild men who knew no God, were as common as Bible verses in her father's house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, an obedient drum beating out the rhythm of everything she had ever been told. But her eyes, her own two eyes, were telling her a different story. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a profound exhaustion that seemed to settle deep in his bones. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth. As he drew closer, she saw his eyes. They were not the wild, merciless eyes from the stories. They were dark, deep-set, and they held a quietness that was almost unnerving. They swept over the town, taking in the closed doors and fearful windows, and there was no anger in them. There was only a kind of weary recognition, as if he had expected nothing else. For a long moment, his gaze met hers. She was frozen, a girl in a dusty dress standing by a house of God, looking at a man the entire town had already condemned. Fear was there, yes, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of profound and unwelcome curiosity. In the depths of his eyes, she did not see a savage. She saw a human being, a man who looked as tired as the parched land he rode through. Then he looked away, his attention moving forward, and the connection was broken. But it left an echo inside her, a troubling vibration that unsettled the foundations of her small, ordered world. His name was Tahu Redhawk. He had once been a warrior of the Dene, the people. He had later been a scout for the United States Army, a ghost who could read the land and track men through a wilderness that terrified the soldiers he served. He had seen the brutal machinery of war from the inside, had guided men to battles that turned his stomach, had been paid in government coin for betraying one world to serve another. He had just been discharged, cast aside after a campaign that had cost him the last of his illusions and left him with a festering wound in his shoulder and deeper, invisible wounds in his soul. He had come to Silver Mesa not for trouble, but for supplies, a sack of flour, salt, perhaps some ammunition. He wanted only to pass through, to be unseen, to find a place in the canyons where he could forget the smell of gunpowder and the sight of men dying. He guided his horse to the livery stable at the far end of the street, the only establishment whose doors remained open for business, if not for welcome. He dismounted with a stiffness that betrayed his injury. He did not speak to the stable owner, a burly man named Henderson, but simply handed over the reins and a coin. The transaction was completed in a silence thick with unspoken words. Henderson took the coin, his face a mask of wary neutrality. Business was business, after all. Evelyn watched until he disappeared into the mercantile, his back straight, his head held high. She turned and walked back to the parsonage, her mind a turmoil of conflicting emotions. The zinnias in her garden suddenly seemed frivolous, their colors too bright for the gray confusion she felt. She entered the cool, dim interior of the house, the scent of old paper and beeswax polish a familiar comfort. Her father, Minister Brooks, was in his study, a tall, gaunt man whose face seemed permanently set in lines of righteous concern. He looked up from his Bible as she entered, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He had seen the arrival from his window. His expression was grim. He told Evelyn she should not have been outside, that it was not proper for a young woman to be seen staring. His voice was low and resonant, the same voice that filled the chapel with warnings of sin and damnation every Sunday. He spoke of the Navajo as a fallen people, godless and dangerous, a scourge upon the land sent to test the faithful. He reminded her that their ways were not God's ways, and that to invite their darkness into one's heart, even through a curious glance, was to risk one's immortal soul. Evelyn stood before him, her hands clasped, her eyes downcast as she had been taught. She murmured that she was sorry, that she had just been tending the garden, but her apology felt hollow in her own ears. For the first time, her father's words did not feel like divine truth. They felt like stones, heavy and cold, and they did not fit the image of the man she had just seen, the man with the tired eyes. She did not argue. Arguing with her father was like arguing with the mountains. He was immovable. Certain of his own terrain, she simply nodded and escaped to the sanctuary of her small bedroom upstairs. The room was plain, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. A simple cross hung on the wall. It was a room for a girl who was expected to be good, quiet, and free of complicated thoughts. But as the sun began to sink, casting long, purple shadows across the desert floor, Evelyn's thoughts were anything but simple. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands lying still in her lap, and replayed the moment his eyes had met hers. It was a look that contained a world of experience she could not begin to imagine, a world of pain and loss that made her own small struggles seem insignificant. The town saw a threat. Her father saw a heathen. But what had she seen? She had seen a man who was alone, who was wounded, and who carried his sorrow with a dignity that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. A deep, unsettling question began to form in her mind. If her father and the entire town were wrong about what they saw in his eyes, what else might they be wrong about? It was a dangerous question, a tremor that threatened the very ground she stood on. Outside, the day's heat began to fade, but inside, Evelyn Brooks, a new and unfamiliar warmth was just beginning to kindle, a spark of doubt that felt dangerously close to a sin. She felt a longing, not for a man, but for a truth that was larger and more complex than the simple, rigid one she had been given. She was the minister's daughter, a shy and proper young woman, but for the first time in her life, she felt a profound and terrifying hunger to understand the world beyond the chapel walls. And it had all begun with the arrival of a stranger whose weariness seemed to mirror a hidden exhaustion in her own soul. 2 days passed, and the dust of Tahu Redhawk's arrival settled back into the rhythms of Silver Mesa. He had not left. He had taken up residence in a dilapidated stone line shack a mile out of town, a relic from a failed prospecting venture years ago. He kept to himself, seen only when he came to the mercantile for a few meager supplies or to water his horse at the public trough. His presence was a low, constant hum of anxiety beneath the town's daily noise. The men at the saloon spoke of him in low voices, their hands resting near their pistols. The women pulled their shawls a little tighter when they saw him, their whispers following him like his own shadow. He was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of fear and suspicion spread to every corner. For Evelyn, those ripples were a constant disturbance to the quiet waters of her life. Her father's warnings had been stark and absolute, yet they could not erase the image of the man's eyes. She found herself replaying that brief moment of connection, trying to reconcile the profound weariness she had seen with the monstrous image painted by the stories of her youth. Her prayers in the chapel felt different, laced with a thread of questioning she could not voice. She looked at the faces of the congregation, at their hard-set certainty, and wondered if they saw the world in shades of gray as she was beginning to, or only in the stark black and white of her father's sermons. On the 3rd day, a restless energy took hold of her. The small parsonage felt like a cage, the neat rows of her garden a set of bars. She needed air, space, a horizon wider than the one framed by her bedroom window. Telling her father she was going for a walk to clear her head, a common enough activity. She took a small basket, ostensibly to gather wildflowers from the mesas that rose gently to the east of town, but her feet, seemingly of their own accord, carried her west, along the dusty track that led out past the livery and toward the open desert. The air was strange that afternoon. The usual breeze had died, leaving a heavy, oppressive stillness. The sky, normally a crisp, brilliant blue, had taken on a hazy, bruised yellow tint. The birds were silent, and the ever-present buzz of insects had ceased. It was a listening quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Waiting. Evelyn, lost in her thoughts, paid it little mind. She was preoccupied with the conflict warring within her, the desire to understand clashing with a lifetime of ingrained fear. She walked farther than she intended, her button-up boots kicking up small puffs of red dust. The town shrank behind her until it was just a collection of small, sun-bleached boxes. Here, the silence was absolute. It was in this profound quiet that she first heard it, a low moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. She paused, listening. The sound grew, a rising hum that vibrated in her chest. She looked to the horizon and saw it. A wall of roiling red was advancing, a monstrous, churning cloud that consumed the sky. A sandstorm. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had been caught in dust devils before, but this was something else entirely, a force of nature on a terrifying scale. She turned and ran, her skirts tangling around her legs, the basket forgotten. But the storm was impossibly fast. The sun was blotted out. The world vanished into a screaming, scouring vortex of sand and wind. The air grew thick, choking. She could not see, could not breathe. The dust was in her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. Disoriented and terrified, she stumbled, her sense of direction gone. The town, her home, her entire world had been erased. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She huddled down, pulling her skirt over her head in a futile attempt to breathe, her body trembling with a fear more primal than any she had ever known. The roar of the wind was a physical blow, threatening to tear her from the ground. Then, Through the maelstrom, a shape emerged, a dark form moving with impossible purpose. A hand, strong and firm, closed around her arm. She cried out, a muffled sound lost in the gale. Through the stinging haze, she saw Tahu Redhawk. His face was wrapped in a strip of cloth, only his eyes visible. They were calm, focused. He did not speak. He simply pulled her to her feet and turned, leaning into the wind, his body a shield against the worst of the blast. She could do nothing but follow, her hand held fast in his, a single point of stability in a world that had come apart. He led her not back toward the town, but away, into the heart of the storm. Every instinct screamed for her to resist, but the strength in his grip was absolute, and the alternative was to be lost and buried alive. He moved with a knowledge that defied the blindness of the storm, as if he could read the land by the feel of it beneath his feet. After what felt like an eternity of struggling against the howling wind, he pulled her down, into a narrow opening between two large boulders. They were in a small, stone structure, barely more than a hut, its single empty window a howling mouth. He pushed the heavy, makeshift wooden door shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a desperate moaning at the walls. For a long moment, they both stood in the dim, swirling dust of the small room, gasping for breath. The silence inside, broken only by the wind and their own ragged breathing, was as deafening as the storm had been. Evelyn leaned against the rough stone wall, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She looked at him. He had pulled the cloth from his face. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes watching the door as if expecting the storm to break it down. He was a stranger, a man her father called a heathen. She was alone with him, trapped, a situation that would ruin her reputation and confirm the town's darkest suspicions. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was no longer the all-consuming panic of the storm. It was a different fear, quieter, more complex, laced with a terrifying and undeniable thread of fascination. He moved away from her, his moccasins silent on the packed earth floor. He went to the small hearth, where a few pieces of mesquite were laid, and with practiced, economical movements, he struck a flint and steel, coaxing a small flame to life. The fire caught, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed back the gloom and danced across the planes of his face. He did not look at her. He seemed content to share the silence, as if her presence was a simple fact, like the storm outside, to be endured rather than questioned. Evelyn watched him. She saw the way the firelight caught the deep lines around his eyes. She saw the tension in his jaw. He was not a monster. He was a man, seeking shelter from the same storm as she. The thought was so simple, yet it felt like a revelation. The exertion of the rescue had clearly taken a toll on him. He moved with a certain stiffness, favoring his left side. He sat on a low stone ledge by the fire, and slowly, painfully, began to shrug out of his army jacket. As he pulled it off, he winced, a sharp intake of breath. He turned his back to her to work his arm free of the sleeve, and in the flickering firelight, she saw it. Through a tear in his worn cotton shirt, high on his shoulder, was the unmistakable puckered scar of an old wound. It was not the clean slice of a knife or the ragged tear of an arrow. It was a small, deep, circular scar, a bullet hole. Her blood ran cold. That wound had not come from a skirmish with a rival tribe. That wound had come from a rifle, from a soldier, from a white man, from her people. It was a brand of betrayal, a physical testament to the world he had served and that had, in turn, tried to kill him. He had been wounded by his own side. He carefully pulled off his shirt, and the full extent of the scar was visible on his bare, copper skin. The muscle around it was tight and knotted. He reached into a small leather pouch, took out a tin of some dark salve, and began to work it into the old wound, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. The sight of that scar did more to dismantle Evelyn's world than any sermon could. The neat lines of good and evil, civilized and savage, friend and foe, blurred and dissolved into a confusing, painful mess. The stories were lies. Or, if not lies, then only one small, cruel part of a much larger, more tragic truth. The man before her was not just a symbol of the wildness she was taught to fear. He was a victim of the civilization she was taught to revere. Tahu must have felt her eyes on him. He stopped rubbing his shoulder and turned his head slightly, looking at her over the wounded joint. His expression was not one of anger or shame. It was one of quiet, weary resignation, as if he knew what she was seeing and what she must be thinking. He had long ago stopped expecting anything different. He was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, rough, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. The storm will pass. It was a simple statement of fact, but it hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Evelyn could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She, the minister's daughter, who knew 100 psalms by heart, could not find a single word to say. What comfort could Scripture offer for a wound like that? He put his shirt back on, his movements careful. He did not put the jacket back on. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. He seemed to have retreated into himself, into a place of memory and pain where she could not follow. And yet, she felt an overwhelming urge to try. She wanted to know his story. She wanted to understand the source of the deep, quiet sadness in his eyes. She was Evelyn Brooks. She had been taught that her world was one of light, and his was one of darkness. But as she sat there, trapped by a storm in a stone hut with a wounded Navajo warrior, she began to suspect that the truth was far more complicated. She was afraid, not of him, but of the vast, unknown territory that was opening up inside her. He had saved her from the storm outside, but in doing so, he had unleashed a much more powerful and dangerous storm within her own heart, and she had a terrifying feeling that this one would not pass so quickly. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and a strange, watery light began to seep into the stone hut. The air was thick with the smell of wet dust. They had not spoken again through the night. Evelyn had dozed fitfully on a bed of old burlap sacks he had laid for her, while Tahu sat watch by the dying embers of the fire, a silent, unmoving guardian. When the light was strong enough, he rose and opened the door. The world outside was transformed, scoured clean and colored in the soft pastels of a new morning. The walk back to Silver Mesa was a silent one. The air was cool and fresh, but a different kind of tension hung between them, heavier than the storm had been. Every rock and cactus seemed to stand in sharper relief, and Evelyn was acutely aware of the space between them, of the man walking steadily at her side. When the town came into view, looking small and fragile in the vast landscape, she saw the first signs of life. A curtain twitched, a door opened a crack, then quickly closed. They were seen. Tahu did not walk her to the parsonage door. He stopped at the edge of town, near the livery stable. His gaze met hers for a brief, unreadable moment. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned and walked toward his own small shelter, his back as straight and unyielding as the mountains behind him. Evelyn hurried home, her heart a confusion of relief and a strange, new ache of disappointment. Her father met her at the door. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury that was far more terrifying than the storm. He did not ask if she was unharmed. He led her into his study, the room where he composed his sermons on damnation, and closed the door. He demanded to know where she had been. His voice was not loud, but it filled the small room with a terrible weight. Trembling, she told him the truth. She told him of the storm, of being lost, of the Navajo finding her and giving her shelter. As she spoke, she saw the lines on her father's face harden from concern into cold judgment. He did not see a rescue. He saw a fall from grace. He told her she had been foolish, reckless. He told her she had spent a night under the roof of a heathen, a savage. He spoke of her reputation, of the shame she had brought upon him and upon the house of God. He warned her, his voice trembling with conviction, that she was to have nothing more to do with the man. She was not to speak to him, not to look at him. She was to pray for forgiveness for her transgression. To associate with him, her father said, was to invite a spiritual darkness that could consume her soul. Evelyn stood and listened. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. For the first time, she did not feel the sting of shame. She felt a slow, burning ember of defiance. She had seen the man's quiet dignity, the pain he carried, her father's words, once the bedrock of her world, now sounded hollow, brittle. She did not argue, but her silence was not one of submission. It was the silence of a seed that has been planted in new, uncertain soil. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with whispers. The story of her night in the storm became twisted, ugly. She saw it in the eyes of the women at the mercantile, the way they would stop talking when she approached, their face masks of pious pity. She heard it in the laughter of the men outside the saloon. She was the minister's daughter who had been alone with the Indian. The implications were a stain she could feel on her skin. Tahu, for his part, seemed oblivious to the talk, or perhaps he was simply accustomed to it. The storm had done considerable damage, and he began to appear in town more frequently. A section of the livery stable roof had been torn away, and Henderson, the owner, was a practical man who valued skill over prejudice. He hired Tahu to help with the repairs. Evelyn found reasons to pass by, an errand to fetch thread for her mending, a walk to deliver a jar of preserves to a neighbor. She would watch from a distance as Tahu worked. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his hands strong and sure. He seemed to understand the wood, the way the pieces fit together, with an innate knowledge that the other men lacked. One afternoon, Henderson's prize mare, a beautiful but skittish palomino, had gotten spooked during the storm and injured her leg. She would not let anyone near her, lashing out with her hooves, her eyes wide with pain and fear. Henderson and his stable hand were about to give up, talking of putting the animal down. Tahu, who had been mending a fence nearby, walked over. He did not approach the horse directly. He stood near the stall, speaking to her in a low, soft voice. It was not English. It was the liquid, melodic cadence of his own tongue. Slowly, the mare's ears stopped pinning back. Her frantic movements ceased. She turned her head and looked at him. He continued to speak, his voice a gentle murmur, and slowly, cautiously, he approached. He did not reach for her. He simply stood beside her, his presence a calming force. After several long minutes, he lifted a hand and laid it on her neck. The horse shuddered but did not pull away. He stroked her, his touch light and reassuring, all the while speaking his soft, strange words. Only then did he kneel and gently examine the injured leg. Evelyn watched, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, her heart in her throat. She had never seen such a thing. The men of Silver Mesa broke horses. They forced them into submission. Tahu had not broken the mare's spirit. He had earned her trust. She saw in that moment a deep and profound connection to the world that she had never known, a wisdom that had nothing to do with books or sermons. It was a language of the soul, and he was fluent in it. Her curiosity deepened into a quiet, reverent admiration. The more she saw of him, the more her father's warnings rang false. The savage he described was nowhere to be seen. In his place was a man of quiet strength, of immense patience, a man who carried a deep sadness, but who could still show such gentleness to a suffering animal. Her struggle became a daily torment. In the chapel, she knelt and prayed for guidance, her words echoing in the empty space. Was it a sin to admire a man for his kindness? Was it a sin to question the beliefs she had been raised with when her own eyes showed her a different truth? It felt like a betrayal of her father, of her faith, of her entire world. It was the sin of looking too long, of allowing her gaze to rest on something forbidden until it became familiar, and then beautiful. One evening, unable to bear the confines of the parsonage, she walked to the small creek that ran behind the town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. She saw him there, downstream, washing the dust of his work from his hands and face. He looked up and saw her, and for a moment, she thought he would turn away. Instead, he simply watched her approach. She stopped a respectful distance away. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a space that felt safe. "The mare," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She is doing better. I saw you with her." He nodded, drying his hands on his buckskin trousers. "She was afraid. The wind sounds like a predator to those who listen." His words were simple, but they held a poetry that resonated deep within her. "You have a gift with them," she said. A flicker of something, perhaps a sad smile, touched his lips. "It is not a gift, it is listening, something your people have forgotten how to do." The words were not an accusation, just a statement of fact. She felt a boldness she did not know she possessed. "The wound on your shoulder," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "The scar, it was from a soldier's rifle, wasn't it?" He did not seem surprised by the question. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, darkening mountains. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, devoid of self-pity. "I wore the blue coat. I showed them the trails. I led them through the canyons." He paused, and the silence was filled with the weight of his memories. They called it a cleansing, a campaign to make the territory safe. He turned his eyes back to her, and in their depths, she saw a desolation that chilled her to the bone. "My wife, my son, they were in a camp the soldiers found. They were not listening for predators that day." The story was delivered in those few, spare sentences, but it was enough. It was a horror beyond anything she could have imagined, an entire world of pain, of unimaginable loss, contained in the quiet grief of this man. He had lost everything to the very people he was serving. He saw the shock and sorrow on her face, the tears welling in her eyes. It was not the pity he was used to, nor the revulsion. It was something else. It was compassion, true and unblemished. In her eyes, Tahu saw a light he thought had been extinguished from the world, a simple, human kindness that asked for nothing. For years, his heart had been a fortress, walled up with grief and bitterness. But this young woman, with her quiet questions and her honest sorrow, had found a crack in the stone. He had saved her from a storm of sand, but he was beginning to realize that she, in her own unknowing way, might be saving him from a storm of the soul. He had seen the way the town treated her, the way they whispered. He knew he was the cause of it, and a part of him wanted to warn her away, to protect her from the poison that always seemed to follow him. But another part, a part he had thought long dead, found itself wanting to stay in the warmth of her quiet, compassionate gaze. The conflict was new, unwelcome, and yet undeniable. He was a danger to her, and yet she was becoming the only thing that felt safe to him. The secret that lay between them after his confession at the creek was a fragile, living thing. It changed the very air Evelyn breathed. Her father's sermons on sin and redemption became a distant drone, the words failing to find purchase in a heart now occupied by a truth far more complex and compelling. She moved through her days in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve ending alive to the possibility of seeing him. A glimpse of his buckskin horse tied to the rail of the mercantile, the distant sound of a hammer from the livery stable. These small things were enough to make her heart leap into her throat. Their shared knowledge was a silent conversation that continued even when they were apart, a thread of understanding that stretched invisibly across the dusty streets of Silver Mesa. The heat of the high summer settled upon the town like a shroud, baking the red earth into a cracked and brittle crust. The sun was a relentless tyrant, and by midday, most sensible folk retreated into the shade. surrendering the streets to the shimmering heat and the buzz of flies. It was in this oppressive, sleepy quiet that the town's fragile peace was shattered. A few children, immune to the heat, were playing a game of tag near the saloon. Young Thomas, the blacksmith's son, darted into the street, his laughter echoing in the still air. No one saw the freight wagon, loaded high with supplies from the next county. Until it was too late. The driver, drowsy from the heat, was slow to react, and the heavy horses plodding along could not be stopped quickly. A woman screamed. Men shouted. For a frozen moment, the entire town watched in horror as the boy stood transfixed, a small figure in the path of the immense, lumbering wagon. Tahu had been replacing a loose board on the mercantile's porch. He moved before anyone else had even finished drawing breath. He was not a blur of motion, but a study in pure, unhesitating efficiency. 3 long strides, a powerful sweep of his arm that lifted the boy from the ground and tossed him toward the safety of the boardwalk, and a last-second pivot to avoid being crushed himself. He was not entirely successful. The heavy front wheel of the wagon caught his side, not a direct hit, but a glancing blow that spun him around and sent him crashing to the ground. The wagon rumbled to a halt. A cloud of dust settled. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the boy's terrified crying. Then the town surged forward. The boy's mother snatched him up, covering him with kisses and frantic prayers. The wagon driver cursed, his face pale, and Tahu pushed himself to his feet, his face a mask of pain. He stood for a moment, leaning against a post, his hand pressed to his ribs. The boy's mother, her gratitude overcoming her fear, rushed to Tahu, thanking him, her words tumbling over one another. He simply nodded, his eyes distant, as if the praise was an unwelcome noise. He pushed away from the post and began to walk, his steps stiff and uneven, back toward the edge of town, toward his solitary stone shack. Several people made hesitant moves to help, but there was something in his posture, a wall of pride and privacy, that kept them at a distance. He had saved one of their own, but he did not belong to them, and his retreat made that perfectly, painfully clear. Evelyn had seen it all from the window of the parsonage. She had felt her heart stop when the boy was in the wagon's path, and then it had begun to beat again with a painful, ragged rhythm as Tahu moved. She watched him walk away, his lean frame rigid with pain, and a fierce, protective instinct rose up in her, so powerful it eclipsed everything else. It eclipsed her father's warnings, the town's whispers, her own ingrained fear. All she saw was a good man who was hurt, a man who had sacrificed his own safety for a child, a man who was now retreating to suffer alone. She could not let it be. Without a second thought, she went to the small medicine chest her father kept in his study. Her hands were steady as she took out a small, round tin of arnica salve, a potent remedy for deep bruises and aches. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She did not pause to consider the consequences. Her purpose was as clear and simple as a line drawn in the sand. She slipped out the back door of the parsonage, keeping to the alleys and the shadows, her path a secret pilgrimage. The sun beat down on her head, and the dust rose in little clouds around her boots. The town was still buzzing with the incident, but no one noticed the minister's daughter as she hurried toward the desert, her face set with a determination that would have shocked anyone who knew her. The stone shack looked small and desolate against the vast, empty landscape. It seemed to have grown from the rock itself, a testament to solitude. The air around it was still. She approached with a sense of trepidation, her resolve wavering for the first time. What was she doing? What would he think? The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, as if to let in a breeze that did not exist. She called his name, her voice sounding small and thin in the immense silence. Tahu. There was no answer. She pushed the door open. The single room was empty, stark and spare, a bedroll in the corner, a small stack of supplies, a cold hearth, He was not there. A pang of disappointment and worry went through her. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic splash of water. It came from behind the shack, a small spring. She knew, trickled down from the rocks there, one of the few sources of constant water so close to town. Driven by a concern that was now stronger than her propriety, she walked around the side of the stone structure. The spring formed a small, shallow pool, shaded by a gnarled, ancient cottonwood tree, its water a clear, cool jewel in the parched land. And he was there. He was standing in the middle of the pool, the water reaching just above his waist. His back was to her. The merciless afternoon sun, filtered through the leaves of the cottonwood, cast dappled patterns of light across his wet skin. She saw the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders, the lean taper of his waist. She saw the old, puckered scar from the bullet, a pale ghost against his copper skin. And she saw the new injury, a dark, ugly bruise already blooming across his ribs, a violent splash of purple and red. He was using a piece of cloth to sluice water over his head and shoulders, the cool streams running down his body, tracing the lines of his muscles, his strength. Evelyn stopped. She could not have moved if the world had caught fire. The air left her lungs. A profound, shocking heat coursed through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a feeling so new, so powerful. It was almost a pain. All her life, the human form had been a thing of shame, to be covered, hidden, spoken of only in whispers. But what she saw before her was not shameful. It was beautiful. It was a landscape of strength and suffering, of life lived hard and without illusion. She saw the story of his life written on his skin, in the new bruise and the old scar, and in that moment, her quiet admiration, her deep compassion, transformed into something else entirely. It became a deep, aching, undeniable longing. She must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a rustle of her skirt. He went still. He did not turn quickly. He turned slowly, with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. His eyes found hers. They were not angry, not surprised, not shaming. They were dark and deep, and they held a profound, quiet understanding. He had seen her. He had seen her looking, and he understood everything she felt, perhaps even before she understood it herself. The silence stretched, thick and electric. The only sounds were the buzz of a dragonfly over the water and the frantic, wild beating of her own heart. He moved toward her, emerging from the water, the droplets clinging to his skin like tiny diamonds. He stood before her, not bothering to cover himself, his gaze never leaving hers. He spoke first, his voice low and soft, a simple statement of fact that held the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "You walked in as I bathed." The sound of his voice broke the spell that had held her frozen. Her own voice, when she found it, was a trembling whisper, but it carried a strange, unshakable conviction. The words came not from her mind, but from a place deeper, a place of pure, intuitive truth she had just discovered. She was not the minister's shy daughter anymore. She was a woman who had finally seen her own heart. "And your heart began to beat only for me," she replied, her gaze as steady as his, a tremor running through her body but not through her soul. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He did not smile, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. He did not need to speak. His answer was in the way he lifted his hand, the water dripping from his fingertips, and gently, so gently, touched her cheek. The touch was a shock, a brand, a promise. It was the breaking of the final wall between them. In that moment, everything fell away. The town, her father, the whispers, the fear. There was only the heat of the day, the coolness of the water on his skin, and the terrifying, exhilarating certainty that she had just stepped out of one life and into another. The shy virgin had walked into the wilderness, and she had no desire to ever go back. Their relationship, which had begun in the dust and been forged in a storm, was now sealed by a look, a touch, a few quiet words. From that day forward, their story would be written not in the harsh light of Silver Mesa, but in the secret, silent, starlit nights of the desert that had become their sanctuary. Their secret world blossomed in the velvet darkness of the desert night. Under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to drip silver light, Evelyn and Tahu would meet. She would slip away from the sleeping parsonage, a ghost in a dark shawl, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He would be waiting for her by the creek, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, in the cool, clean air, away from the suffocating judgment of Silver Mesa. They were not the minister's daughter and the Navajo outcast. They were simply a man and a woman. He taught her the names of the constellations in his own tongue, stories of Coyote and the creator gods woven into the fabric of the night sky. She, in turn, read to him from a small book of poems she kept hidden, her soft voice a strange and beautiful music in the vast silence. They spoke of his lost family, of her constrained life, of the pain and the small joys that had shaped them. In these stolen hours, a love as fierce and quiet as the desert itself took root, a bond forged in shared solitude and a desperate, unspoken need for acceptance. The days were a torment of watchful eyes and forced smiles, but the nights were a sanctuary where their true selves could finally breathe. This fragile peace was shattered by the sound of gunshots. It was a Tuesday, the hottest day of a relentlessly hot month, and the town was sluggish with afternoon heat. The first shot was a sharp crack that cut through the thick air, followed by two more. Then came shouting, the splintering of wood, and the terrified whinny of a horse. Evelyn was in her garden, staking a tomato vine, and she froze, her hands covered in dirt. A wave of primal fear washed over the town. Doors slammed shut, the streets emptied in an instant. From her vantage point, she could see the front of the Silver Mesa Bank and Trust. Two men, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, burst out, carrying heavy sacks. They were dressed in a grotesque mockery of Navajo attire, with cheap store-bought beads and feathers tied haphazardly in their hair. It was a costume, a crude and vicious lie painted on the canvas of a violent act. They fired their pistols into the air, whooping and yelling, before leaping onto their horses and galloping out of town, leaving a cloud of red dust and stunned silence in their wake. Inside the bank, the teller, a young man named Peterson, lay on the floor, bleeding from a wound in his leg. The robbery had been swift, brutal, and calculated, and the robbers had left behind their calling card, a deliberately false one. It did not take long for the town's shock to curdle into a familiar, ugly rage. The whispers started immediately. An Indian raid, savages. They pointed to the feathers, the beads, the whoops. It was proof, and in a town with only one Indian, there was only one place to point the finger of blame. The logic was as simple and deadly as a loaded gun. Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority came more from the town's consensus than from any real skill, quickly formed a posse. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard with a righteous certainty. Evelyn watched from her window as they rode out, a wave of armed and angry men heading west, toward Tahu's stone shack. Her blood ran cold. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that he had nothing to do with it. But she also knew that in the eyes of Silver Mesa, his guilt had been decided long before the first shot was ever fired. They brought him back an hour later, his hands bound in front of him, a rope looped around his neck. He was on foot, forced to walk behind the sheriff's horse, his head held high, his expression a mask of stone. They had found him mending a leather strap outside his home, and he had not resisted. He had simply looked at them with his weary, knowing eyes, as if he had been expecting this kind of injustice his entire life. They pushed him into the small, squalid jailhouse behind the sheriff's office and locked the door. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caged. Justice would be done. But for Evelyn, the world had tilted on its axis. The sight of him being led through the streets like an animal, the quiet dignity of his posture in the face of such hatred. It broke something inside her, the last of her fear, the last of her obedience, crumbled into dust. She went to her father. She found him in his study, pacing, his face a mixture of grim satisfaction and agitation. He was already composing the sermon he would deliver on Sunday, a sermon about the forces of darkness being vanquished by the righteous. She stood before him, her hands trembling, and she told him that they had the wrong man. She told him Tahu was innocent. Her father stopped pacing. He looked at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. He told her not to be a fool. The evidence was clear. He was a savage, and this was their nature. Evelyn's voice grew stronger, fueled by a desperation she did not know she possessed. She told her father that she knew Tahu, that he was a good man, a man of honor, a man who had suffered. Her father's face darkened. "You know him?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "How is it, Evelyn, that you have come to know the nature of this heathen?" And then the choice was before her, to retreat into silence, or to stand in the terrible, cleansing light of the truth. She chose the truth. She told him everything, about the storm, about their talks by the creek, about the growing certainty in her heart that their world was built on a foundation of lies and hatred. She did not speak of love, but it was there in every word, in the fierce defense of the man she had come to care for. As she spoke, she watched her father's face transform. The concern of a parent was burned away, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a zealot whose faith has been challenged. He saw her not as his daughter, but as a vessel of corruption, a soul lost to the very darkness he preached against. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. He raised a trembling hand and pointed a finger at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was the voice of judgment, the voice of God from the pulpit. "You are no longer my daughter," he said, each word a stone. "You have chosen the path of the heathen. You have lain with the serpent in the dust and invited his poison into your heart. You have become an abomination in the eyes of the Lord and in the eyes of this community. I cast you out from my house and from my heart. May God have mercy on your fallen soul, for I have none." The words were a physical blow. He did not shout them. He spoke them with a chilling, final certainty that was far worse. He was not just angry. He was finished with her. He turned his back on her, a final act of banishment, and looked out the window at the town he believed he was protecting. Numb, shattered, Evelyn left the parsonage, the house she had lived in her entire life. She was an outcast. She had no home, no family. The whispers that had followed her before now became open taunts. As she walked toward the sheriff's office, the women pulled their children away, their face masks of open contempt. Men on the boardwalk called out vile names, their words striking her with the force of stones. They called her a harlot, a traitor to her own kind, a blasphemer who had forsaken God for a savage. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward, but inside, she was bleeding from 1,000 invisible wounds. The sheriff refused to see her at first, but she would not leave. She stood in his office until he finally emerged, his face annoyed. She told him again that Tahu was innocent. She told him that Tahu would never disguise himself, that his honor would not allow it. The sheriff simply laughed, a short, ugly sound. He told her that everyone knew she was the Indian's woman, that her word meant nothing. He told her to go home. She had no home to go to. Her last hope was to see Tahu, the deputy, a young man with pity in his eyes. Let her into the back. The jail was a single, stifling cell with a cot and a bucket. Tahu was standing at the barred window, looking out at the small patch of sky he was allowed. He turned when she entered. The stone mask was gone from his face. In its place was a deep, aching sorrow. "You should not be here, Evelyn," he said, his voice low. "They are going to kill you," she whispered, her hands gripping the cold iron bars. "For something you did not do." "This is my fight," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "It has always been my fight. You cannot be a part of it. Look what they have done to you already." "I do not care what they have done," she insisted, tears finally streaming down her face. "I will not let them do this. I will find a way." "There is no way," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is their world, and their justice. You must leave Silver Mesa. Go somewhere you can be safe." "Forget you ever knew me." He was trying to save her. He was willing to face the gallows if it meant she would be safe from the poison of this town. "I will not," she said, her voice fierce with a love that had now become her only strength. "I will not leave you." He reached a hand through the bars, his fingers brushing her tear-stained cheek. His touch was as gentle as it had been by the spring, but it was filled with the agony of a farewell. "You must," he whispered. He then turned away from her, presenting her with his unyielding back, a silent, heartbreaking dismissal. He could not bear to see the pain he was causing her, the pain he could not prevent. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her heart breaking. Then she turned and walked out of the jail, out into the hostile streets of Silver Mesa. Her father had cast her out. The town had condemned her, and now the man she loved was pushing her away for her own good. She was utterly alone, but as she stood in the blood-red dust of the street, a new and terrible resolve began to form in the ashes of her old life. They had taken everything from her. She had nothing left to lose, and she would not let them take him too. The blood in the dust would not be his. The justice of Silver Mesa was a public spectacle. It was not held in the sheriff's office, but in the open, dusty space between the saloon and the mercantile, so that all could see and feel their part in it. A heavy table had been dragged out for Sheriff Miller and Mayor Thompson to sit at, giving the proceedings a thin, shabby veneer of officialdom. The entire town was there, a restless, sweaty crowd, their faces hard and expectant. They were not here for a trial. They were here for a verdict they had already rendered. Evelyn stood at the very back, a solitary island in a sea of hostility. The crowd parted around her as if she carried a plague, their glares and muttered curses a constant. Low assault. She ignored them. Her eyes were fixed on Tahu. He stood before the table, his hands still bound, flanked by two armed men. He was no longer the weary traveler or the quiet workman. He was a warrior facing his final battle, not with weapons, but with an unassailable stillness. His gaze swept over the angry faces, calm and assessing. But it was for her that he reserved a fleeting look of profound, aching regret. He was not afraid for himself, she realized. He was afraid for her. The trial was a farce. Sheriff Miller laid out the evidence, the testimony of the bank teller who, in his terror, had seen only feathers and dark skin, the discovery of a single, cheap feather near Tahu's shack, the collective certainty of the town. Mayor Thompson, his face a mask of solemn civic duty, spoke of the need to protect their homes, their families, their way of life from the savage threat at their door. Every word was a nail being hammered into Tahu's coffin. The crowd roared its approval. The cry went up, low at first, then rising to a unified chant. "Hang him! Hang him!" Evelyn felt a cold dread mixed with a white-hot fury. This was not justice. It was a ritual sacrifice, and Tahu was the offering meant to appease their fear. She watched the faces in the crowd, the men she had known her whole life, their features twisted with a righteous hatred. And she watched Mayor Thompson, his eyes glittering, orchestrating the mob with the skill of a conductor. There was a satisfaction in his posture that went beyond civic duty. It was personal. It was triumphant. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a flaw in their story, a thread she could pull. The crude costumes. Why would a Navajo warrior disguise himself as a clumsy caricature of his own people? It made no sense. And where was the money the posse had torn his shack apart and found nothing? The questions burned in her, But she had no one to ask, no one who would listen. Her gaze fell again upon Mayor Thompson, and a memory, small and insignificant at the time, surfaced a week before the robbery. She had been delivering a basket of vegetables to the mayor's wife and had seen him in the street, speaking in low, urgent tones to two rough-looking strangers, drifters who had been in town for a few days. One of the men had a pistol tucked into his belt with a distinctive, almost garish, mother-of-pearl grip. She had noticed it because it was so out of place on such a disreputable man. The drifters had left town the day before the robbery. A terrible, sickening suspicion began to form in her mind. The mayor had been complaining for months about the financial state of the town, about his own failing investments. It was a desperate gamble, a thought so monstrous she almost dismissed it. But the image of the mayor's triumphant face would not leave her. He had a large storage warehouse at the edge of town where he kept goods for his mercantile. It was a place no one would think to look. As the trial concluded and the sheriff announced that Tahu would be held for hanging at dawn, a wave of grim satisfaction washed over the crowd. They began to disperse, heading for the saloon to celebrate their victory over the forces of darkness. In the confusion, Evelyn slipped away. She was no longer the minister's daughter. She was a hunter, and she had caught a scent. Night fell quickly, blanketing the town in a nervous, expectant silence. The saloon was loud with drunken celebration, a stark contrast to the quiet of the empty streets. Evelyn, wrapped in a dark shawl, moved like a shadow. The mayor's warehouse loomed before her, a large, dark block against a sky full of stars. The lock on the side door was old and flimsy. A heavy rock was all it took to break it. She slipped inside, her heart hammering. The air was thick with the smell of canvas, aging wood, and rat droppings. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, creating eerie shapes in the darkness. She moved carefully, her hands outstretched. Searching, she passed crates of tools, barrels of flour, stacks of dry goods. It was in a back corner, hidden beneath a pile of dusty tarps, that she found them. 2 heavy sacks of coin, stamped with the seal of the Silver Mesa Bank, and beside them, a bundle of clothes, buckskin trousers, cheap beaded vests, and a handful of loose feathers. Her breath caught in her throat, and there, tucked into a belt, was the pistol. She picked it up. The mother-of-pearl grip was cool and smooth against her palm, a solid, undeniable piece of the truth. She had it. She had the proof. A wave of triumphant relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She gathered up the pistol and one of the sacks of money, her mind already racing toward the sheriff's office. She never made it out the door. It swung open, and a lantern filled the space with a sudden, blinding light. Mayor Thompson stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him was the young deputy, his expression a miserable mix of fear and guilt. "I thought I might find a rat scavenging in here," the mayor said, his voice dripping with venom. "I just did not expect it to be the preacher's girl." Evelyn stood her ground, her fear eclipsed by her righteous anger. She held up the pistol. "It is over. Mayor, I know what you did. You hired those men. You framed an innocent man to cover your own crimes." The mayor did not even have the decency to look surprised. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Innocent," he sneered. "He is an Indian. There is no such thing. And who, my dear girl, is going to believe you, the fallen woman, the savage's lover? You have no voice in this town anymore. Your father saw to that." He took a step toward her, his eyes cold and calculating. "You have become a nuisance, Evelyn, a loose end, and I always tie up my loose ends." He lunged for her. She tried to run, but the deputy, his face pale with sweat, grabbed her arm. They took the evidence from her, their hands rough and bruising. She fought, a wild creature trapped and desperate, but she was no match for them. They dragged her to a small, windowless storeroom at the back of the warehouse and threw her inside, the heavy bolt on the door sliding shut with a sound of absolute finality. She was left in total darkness, with the smell of dust and the crushing weight of despair. In his cell, Tahu waited. He had watched the town's drunken celebration from his barred window. He had watched the moon climb high into the sky. And he had watched for Evelyn. He knew she would not have given up. When the hours passed and there was no sign of her, a cold fear, a fear he had not felt for himself, began to grip him. He knew the mayor. He had seen the greed and the cunning in the man's eyes. He knew Evelyn's desperate search for the truth would lead her straight into the serpent's nest. He could not wait for morning. He began to work, with a focus born of a lifetime of survival. He examined the iron cot he had been given. A metal slat near the bottom was loose. With slow, patient, silent effort, he worked it back and forth, the groan of the metal lost in the distant noise from the saloon. Finally, it came free. It was a flat, heavy bar of iron, a perfect lever. He wedged it into the weak point of the lock on his cell door, a place he had noticed when he was first thrown in. He put his weight against it. The metal shrieked once, a high, piercing sound, and then the lock gave way. He moved through the sleeping town like a ghost. He kept to the shadows, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. He did not know where she was, but he was a tracker. He went first to the parsonage, a place he knew she had been cast out of. From there, her trail was faint, but it was there, a story told in a few disturbed patches of dust, a single, hurried footprint. It led him to the mayor's warehouse. He saw the broken lock. He heard the low murmur of voices from inside. The mayor and the deputy, planning what to do with their captive. His hand went to the knife he had hidden in his boot. He did not go in the front. He circled the building, silent as an owl, and found a loose board near the back. He slipped inside, into the darkness she had faced alone. He heard her faint, desperate sobs from the storeroom. He was at the door in a heartbeat. The bolt was heavy, but the wood around it was old. Using the iron bar from his cell, he pried it loose with a single, powerful wrench of his shoulders. The door swung open. Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief in the faint moonlight. He put a finger to his lips, pulled her to her feet, and led her out into the night. They did not speak. There was no time. He led her to the livery stable, where he saddled not one, but 2 horses. They rode out of Silver Mesa, leaving the town of lies and hatred behind them. 2 fugitives under a dark and watchful sky. They rode hard for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the dawn that would bring the hunt. And then the world began to change. The wind rose, a low, mournful moan that grew into a vicious shriek. The stars were blotted out. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of grit. A storm, more violent and sudden than the one that had first thrown them together, was upon them. The sand came in a solid, horizontal wall, scouring the landscape, erasing everything. They were forced from their horses, huddling together behind a small outcropping of rock. The terrified animals pressed close behind them. The wind was a physical force, a deafening roar that made thought impossible. It was a world of pure, elemental chaos. In a brief lull, when the roar softened to a scream, Evelyn turned to him. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burned with a fierce, unwavering light. They had lost everything. They were being hunted. They were trapped in a maelstrom that threatened to bury them alive, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. She put her lips close to his ear, her voice a raw, desperate cry against the gale. "They call me fallen," she shouted, the words torn from the very center of her soul. "But I only fell into truth, into you." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. And in the heart of that raging storm, he saw not the minister's daughter, but a warrior in her own right, a woman whose courage matched his own, the last of his defenses. The wall of grief and pain he had built around his heart was obliterated. He pulled her to him, his hand tangling in her wild hair, and his mouth found hers. Their kiss was not gentle. It was savage, desperate, and utterly complete. It was the taste of sand and tears and blood and survival. It was two broken souls finding their whole, true selves in each other. It was a vow made in the heart of a hurricane, a promise that they would face whatever came next, not as two fugitives, but as one heart, one spirit, one truth against the world. The storm raged around them, but within its violent embrace, they had found their only true sanctuary. The storm passed as violently as it had arrived. It left behind a world remade, washed clean and utterly silent. The sun rose on a landscape of sculpted red sand, the air cool and crystalline. Evelyn and Tahu were alive, huddled together, their bodies aching, their clothes stiff with dried mud and grit. The ordeal had stripped them down to their essential selves, leaving no room for pretense or fear. They were simply two survivors in a vast, empty world. Tahu rose first, his movement slow but purposeful. He checked on the horses, who stood with their heads hung low, trembling but unharmed. He gave Evelyn a water skin, and the cool liquid was a blessing on her parched throat. He did not speak of the kiss, nor of her confession. Words were inadequate for what had passed between them. It was now a part of their very being, a truth as solid as the rock that had sheltered them. Their flight from Silver Mesa was no longer an escape. It was a journey toward something. He led them north, into the labyrinthine canyons and towering mesas that had always been the border of Evelyn's known world. For days, they traveled through a landscape of breathtaking, brutal beauty. The straight lines and rigid angles of Silver Mesa, with its church steeple and neat fences, dissolved into a distant memory. Here, everything was curved, ancient, and alive. The wind had carved the rock into cathedrals. The sun painted the canyon walls in shifting shades of ochre and rose, and the silence was a presence, a deep and resonant hum that settled into her bones. Evelyn's old life fell away with every mile. Her respectable dress was torn and stained, her soft boots scraped and worn. The carefully constructed identity of the minister's daughter was a skin she was slowly, painfully shedding. Tahu taught her how to survive. He showed her which plants held water, how to read the tracks of animals in the sand, how to find shelter from the relentless sun. He moved through this world not as a conqueror, but as a part of it, and she began to see through his eyes, to understand the land not as a wilderness to be feared and tamed, but as a home to be respected and understood. Just as her strength was beginning to fail, when she felt she could not ride for another hour, they arrived. Tahu led her through a narrow, hidden fissure in a canyon wall, a passage so concealed she would have ridden past it 100 times without noticing. The passage opened into a valley, a slash of impossible green nestled deep in the heart of the red rock. A clear stream ran through it, lined with cottonwood trees. Small, sturdy hogans made of earth and wood were scattered among the rocks, their smoke rising in thin, blue columns into the clear air. This was the Valley of Dawn, the hidden sanctuary of his people. Their arrival was met not with welcome, but with a guarded, suspicious silence. People emerged from the hogans, their faces etched with the same deep lines of sorrow and resilience she had seen in Tahu's. They were the survivors of the cleansing, the remnants of a proud people who had lost everything. They looked at Tahu with a mixture of relief and concern, but their eyes fell upon Evelyn with a cold, hard mistrust. She was a white woman. She was the enemy. An old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles and wisdom, came forward. Her name was Astza, and her authority was clear in the way the others deferred to her. She looked at Evelyn, her black eyes missing nothing, and spoke to Tahu in their own tongue. His replies were low and calm, but Evelyn could feel the tension in the air. He was pleading a case, his case, her case. Astza's gaze remained on Evelyn. She saw the torn dress, the sunburnt face, the exhaustion in her eyes. But she also saw the defiance, the quiet strength that had carried her this far. She spoke a few final, sharp words to Tahu, and then turned and walked back to her hogan. leaving them standing in the center of the silent village. "She says you may stay for now," Tahu translated, his voice weary. "She says the desert will be your judge, and so will they." The trial that followed was one of silent observation. There were no accusations, no questions. There was only the weight of their collective gaze. Evelyn was given a space in an empty hogan, a place to sleep, and was offered a share of their food. But she was an outsider, a ghost in their midst. The other women would fall silent when she approached. The children would stop their games and stare. It was a loneliness more profound than any she had ever known. For it was a loneliness born not of solitude, but of rejection. She knew she could not win their trust with words. Her world, the world of sermons and books, had no currency here. So she worked. She followed the other women, watching their hands. She learned to grind corn on a rough stone slab until her shoulders ached and her palms were raw. She learned to treat and soften deer hides, a smelly, laborious process that made her stomach turn but that she performed without complaint. She learned to mend clothes with an awl and sinew, her delicate needlework skills useless here. Her body changed. She grew leaner, stronger. Her hands, once soft and pale, became brown and calloused, a testament to her labor. She shed her last remaining vanities, her last vestiges of the woman she had been. She learned the rhythms of the valley, rising with the sun, sleeping with the stars. And in the process, she began to find a new kind of freedom. It was not the freedom of having choices, but the freedom of having a purpose that was clear and simple and true. Her purpose was to contribute, to earn her place, to be of use. Tahu was her guide and her protector. He did not shield her from the work or the judgment, but he stood by her. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would walk by the stream, and he would tell her the stories of his people, of their gods, of their connection to this land. He taught her that justice was not a matter of laws and hangings, but of balance, to live in harmony with the land, with one's people, with one's own heart. This, he told her, was Hozho, the central principle of his world. It meant beauty, order, harmony, and health, and it was what his people, and what he himself, were trying to find again. The turning point came not in a single dramatic moment, but in a quiet act of shared humanity. A fever swept through the small settlement, taking hold of the very young and the very old. Asa and the other women worked tirelessly, using their knowledge of herbs, but the fever was stubborn. One of the youngest children, a small boy, was especially ill, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His mother sat beside him, her face a mask of exhausted despair. Evelyn watched, her heart aching for them. She remembered her own mother, who had died of a fever when she was a child, and she remembered the stories her mother used to tell her. Simple, gentle stories from the Bible, not of wrath and judgment, but of comfort and peace. She hesitated for only a moment, then went and knelt beside the grieving mother. She did not offer medicine or advice. She simply began to speak, her voice low and soft. She told the story of the shepherd who left his flock of 99 to search for the one lost sheep. She told it not as a sermon, but as a simple tale of love and devotion. The mother did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She understood the compassion in Evelyn's voice, the shared language of a heart that knows loss. She looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, her eyes were not filled with suspicion, but with a flicker of recognition. Later that night, the child's fever broke. It was not a miracle. It was coincidence, or perhaps the herbs finally taking effect. But in the eyes of the people, it was a sign. The white woman had not brought a curse. She had sat with them in their sorrow and offered what she had the comfort of her own heart. After that, the ice began to thaw. Asa brought her a gift, a soft deerskin dress, simply made but far more suited to this life than her tattered calico. It was a gesture of acceptance. The women began to include her in their conversations, teaching her words in their language, showing her the finer points of their crafts. They learned that her heart was not white, as they had feared, but simply human. Evelyn had been reborn. She had been cast out of one world and had to earn her place in another. She had learned that freedom was not the absence of rules, but the discovery of which rules truly mattered. The law of her father's church had been a cage. The law of this valley, the law of balance and respect, was a liberation. She looked at Tahu, at the quiet strength in his face, and she knew that their love was not a transgression. As her father had preached, it was the purest expression of Hozo, an act of finding balance and harmony in a broken world. She had learned to see not with the judgmental eyes of Silver Mesa, but with the open heart of the valley. And she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and true as the canyons around her, that she was finally home. 5 years passed. They were years measured not in the ticking of a clock or the turning of a calendar page, but in the passing of seasons across the valley. Evelyn's world, which had once been a small, fenced garden, expanded to the vastness of the horizon. She learned the language of the Dine, not perfectly, but with the fluency of the heart. Her love for Tahu deepened from the desperate passion of their flight into a quiet, steady flame, a hearth fire that warmed their small hogan and their shared life. A son was born to them, a beautiful boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quiet smile. They named him Yiska, which meant the night had passed. Life in the Valley of Dawn was hard, a constant negotiation with the land, but it was a life of profound truth and simple beauty. Evelyn, the woman who had once fought to coax pale zinnias from the red dust, now knew the satisfaction of grinding the corn that would feed her family, of weaving a blanket that would warm her child, of living a life that was necessary and whole. The ghost of the minister's daughter was gone, replaced by a woman whose spirit was as strong and resilient as the ancient junipers that clung to the canyon walls. The desire to return was not a sudden decision, but a slow, dawning realization. It was not a yearning for her old life, but a need for closure, a final quiet step in her journey. She needed to see Silver Mesa again, not as the frightened girl who had fled it, but as the woman she had become. She needed to lay the past to rest in the place where it had been born. Tahu understood. He knew that to be truly free, she had to face the cage she had escaped from, and know that its bars no longer had the power to hold her. They rode back into Silver Mesa on a late autumn afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky, casting long, forgiving shadows. The town was much the same, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the vastness of the desert. But something was different. The air of angry certainty was gone, replaced by a kind of weary quiet. They came from the west, just as Tahu had done all those years ago. But he was not alone this time. Evelyn rode beside him, her deerskin dress worn and comfortable, her face browned by the sun, her hair in a single, thick braid down her back. And seated before Tahu on his saddle was Yiska, his small hand gripping the pommel, his dark eyes taking in the strange, straight lines of the white man's world. Their arrival was a silent explosion. People stopped in the street. Faces appeared in windows, but there were no shouts, no curses. The men outside the saloon, some of whom had called for Tahu's death, simply stared, their mouths agape. Henderson came to the door of the livery stable, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like shame. He met Tahu's gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded his head, a gesture of respect that was 5 years too late, but was offered nonetheless. Women on the boardwalk pulled their shawls around them, but they did not pull their children away. They watched the small family ride by, their eyes filled with a stunned, grudging wonder. They saw not the savage and the fallen woman, but a man, a woman, and their child. A family whose quiet dignity was a judgment on the town's past hatred. They rode the length of the single street. They passed the mayor's warehouse, which now stood empty and dilapidated. They had heard the stories from travelers who passed near the valley. Mayor Thompson had been exposed a year after their escape, when one of the drifters he had hired was caught for another crime and confessed everything. The town's justice, which had been so swift and certain with Tahu, had been slow and reluctant with its own leader. Thompson was gone, and the town was still living in the shadow of his betrayal. Evelyn's gaze fell upon the parsonage. It looked smaller, sadder. The paint was peeling, and the small garden she had tended with such care was overgrown with weeds, the red dust having reclaimed its territory. Her father was no longer there. He had left Silver Mesa a year after she had, his spirit broken, his congregation having lost its faith in a man whose righteous anger had blinded him to the truth in his own house. She felt a pang of sorrow, not for the man who had cast her out, but for the father she had once loved, a man lost in his own rigid, lonely world. She dismounted in front of the small, white chapel. Its door was closed, but not locked. She looked at Tahu. He understood. He stayed outside with Yiska, a silent guardian, giving her the space she needed. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of old wood and hymnals. Light filtered through the plain glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Nothing had changed. The pews were the same. The simple wooden cross on the wall was the same. She had once trembled in this room, her heart full of fear and guilt. Now, she felt only a profound, quiet peace. She walked to the front, her moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. She found a small, half-burned candle in a holder. She lit it, the small flame a bright, defiant spark in the gloom. She knelt, not in supplication, but in a kind of quiet communion with her own past. She did not pray for forgiveness. She had done nothing that needed forgiving. She gave thanks. She gave thanks for the storm that had shattered her world. She gave thanks for the courage she had found in the depths of despair. And she gave thanks for the man who had shown her that the only true faith is the one you find in your own heart. She stayed there for a long time, the silence of the chapel a comforting blanket. When she finally rose and walked back out into the brilliant, late afternoon light, she felt as if a final, heavy stone had been lifted from her soul. She had not come back to reclaim a place in this town. She had come back to reclaim herself, and she had found that she was already whole. They left Silver Mesa as the sun began to touch the horizon, painting the sky in the fiery colors she had come to love. They did not look back. They rode out into the desert, their home, their sanctuary. They made camp for the night in the shelter of a tall mesa, the stars beginning to prick the deep purple of the sky. The fire crackled, a small island of warmth and light in the vast darkness. Yiska was asleep, wrapped in a soft blanket. Evelyn stood watching the last sliver of sun disappear, a feeling of deep, profound contentment settling over her. She had faced her ghosts, and they had no power over her. She had chosen her life, and it was a good life. From behind her, she heard his voice, low and familiar, the sound that was more home to her than any building. "Evelyn, come here." She turned and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. She walked to him, to the fire, to the man who was her heart's entire world. She sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, pulling her close. Her head rested on his shoulder, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was a rhythm she knew as well as her own, the rhythm that had called to her from the very first day. Her own heart answered, beating with the same fierce, unwavering love, because she knew that true love did not fear the wind or the dust or the judgment of others. It only feared not having the courage to choose. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.